The battle was over. Smoke and fire filled the air as human warships burned in the cold darkness of space. Captain Ethan Voss lay on the cold metal floor of the alien prison ship, his hands bound behind his back. His head ached, and his body was covered in bruises from the fight. He had fought until the last moment, but the Xilari warriors were too strong. They were taller, faster, and heavily armored. Now he was their prisoner. The Xilari Imperium was a warrior empire that ruled many star systems with an iron fist. They believed in honor, strength, and discipline. Humans were nothing but a nuisance to them, a weak species fighting a war they could never win. Ethan knew what happened to prisoners of war. He expected torture, interrogation, maybe even death. But something strange happened. No one spoke to him. The Xilari guards who dragged him into the prison ship remained silent. They locked him inside a small dark cell with metal walls and a single narrow window. He could see the stars outside, distant and unreachable. The silence was unsettling. In every war he had fought, enemies always tried to break their prisoners, force them to talk. But here, there were no questions, no threats. After hours, maybe days, the door finally opened. A tall Xilari woman stepped inside. She was different from the guards. She carried herself with authority, her posture straight, her golden eyes sharp. She wore the black and silver armor of a high-ranking officer. A long, curved sword rested on her hip. Ethan sat up. His body ached, but he refused to show weakness. "So, you're finally here to interrogate me?" he asked, his voice hoarse but steady. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, watching him with an unreadable expression. Ethan frowned. "What, cat got your tongue? Or do you guys not speak basic?" Still, she said nothing. A realization hit him. Maybe it wasn't that she didn't want to speak. Maybe she wasn't allowed to. He smirked. "Ah, I get it. You have some kind of rule, don't you? No talking to prisoners." She didn't react, but something flickered in her golden eyes, just for a second. Ethan chuckled. "That's a shame. I was hoping for some company. It gets lonely in here." The woman turned sharply and walked out, the heavy door locking behind her. Ethan leaned back against the cold wall, his smirk fading. This was different from anything he had expected. If the Xilari weren't trying to break him, what was their plan? And why did this warrior woman seem conflicted? For the first time since his capture, Ethan felt something new, curiosity. And something told him this wasn't the last time he would see her. Ethan Voss sat on the hard metal floor of his prison cell, staring at the ceiling. It had been days. At least, that's what it felt like. There was no way to tell time in this place. The artificial lights never changed, and the silence was unbearable. No interrogations, no beatings, no attempts to break him. Just silence. And then she returned. The door hissed open, and the tall Xilari woman stepped inside. Her golden eyes locked onto him, cold and unreadable. She was the same one from before, the high-ranking officer with the black and silver armor. She carried no weapons except for the curved sword on her hip. Ethan sat up, stretching his sore muscles. "Back so soon?" "I was just starting to enjoy the quiet." She didn't answer. Ethan studied her. She wasn't like the other Xilari guards, who avoided looking at him like he was nothing more than dirt beneath their boots. She stood tall, proud, but there was something else in her gaze, something he couldn't quite place. He leaned forward slightly. "Still not talking, huh? You know, I've been in a lot of prisons, but this is the first time I've met a warden who refuses to speak." She remained silent. Ethan sighed. "All right, let's play a game. I'll guess your name." He pointed at her. "You look like a... Xilari names are hard, but I'll try. Is it Zorvek?" "No? What about Kiris?" "Nothing." He smirked. "Okay, fine. I'll call you Silent Warden. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Still, she said nothing. But he swore he saw the tiniest flicker of amusement in her golden eyes. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. Ethan exhaled and leaned back against the cold wall. You know, I expected something different when I got captured. Torture, interrogation, maybe some evil alien general trying to break me. But this is strange. The silent warden took a slow step closer. Ethan tensed. Was she finally going to say something? Instead, she reached into her belt and pulled out a small metal container. She placed it on the floor and slid it toward him with her foot. Ethan glanced down. Food. Not the usual cold, tasteless prison rations. Something better. He looked up at her, suspicious. What's this? You're not trying to poison me, are you? She didn't respond. Ethan hesitated, then picked up the container and opened it. The scent of cooked meat and something spicy filled the air. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten properly in days. He took a bite. It was good. Too good. He looked back at her. Why? For the first time, something in her expression softened. Just a little. Then, without a word, she turned and left. The door locked behind her. Ethan chewed slowly, deep in thought. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't his enemy. Ethan Voss lay on the cold floor of his prison cell, staring at the ceiling. His body ached, but his mind was more restless than ever. The silent warden, his mysterious auxiliary captor, had visited him again. She never spoke, never showed emotion, yet she had given him real food. Why? He didn't understand her. She was supposed to be his enemy, yet she wasn't cruel. And that made him more curious than ever. The days passed in the same strange pattern. She would enter, stand in silence, watch him for a few moments, and then leave. Sometimes she brought food. Sometimes she just observed. The other auxiliary guards ignored him completely. It was like he didn't exist. But one night, everything changed. Ethan was dozing off when he heard something. Footsteps, fast and urgent. Then, a scream. Not human. Auxiliary. He shot up, his senses alert. The sound came from outside his cell. Then, a loud thud. Something heavy hitting the floor. Silence. Then, the door to his cell slid open. Ethan jumped to his feet, expecting guards. Instead, he saw the silent warden. Her sword was drawn, its curved blade dripping with dark purple blood. Behind her, an auxiliary soldier lay motionless, his weapon still clutched in his lifeless hands. Ethan's heart pounded. What the hell just happened? The silent warden looked at him. Her golden eyes were sharp, alert, but beneath them, he saw something else. Concern. She hesitated. And then, for the first time, she spoke. Danger, she whispered. Her voice was low, almost hesitant, as if she was breaking a sacred rule by speaking to him. Ethan stared at her. It wasn't much, but it was the first word he had ever heard from her. Before he could respond, she stepped into the cell and grabbed his arm. Her grip was firm, strong, but not painful. Move, she whispered again. Ethan's instincts kicked in. If she was telling him to move, it meant he was in trouble. He followed her out of the cell, stepping over the fallen guard. His mind raced with questions. Who attacked? He asked in a hushed tone. She didn't answer. She led him down a dark corridor, her movements quick and precise. The prison ship was eerily quiet, too quiet. Then, from the shadows, a figure lunged at them. Another auxiliary soldier, his eyes filled with fury. He swung a plasma dagger straight at the warden's chest, but she was faster. In a single fluid motion, she dodged the attack and drove her sword through the attacker's side. The soldier gasped, his body shuddering before collapsing. Ethan exhaled sharply. Dan, remind me never to fight you. The warden turned to him, her expression unreadable. Come. Ethan followed, his mind spinning. The silent warden had broken her oath. She had spoken to him. And that meant everything was about to change. Ethan's heart pounded as he followed the silent warden through the dimly lit corridors of the prison ship. She moved with precision, her sword still dripping with dark Silari blood. The air smelled of burnt metal and something else. Danger. Where are we going? Ethan whispered. She didn't answer. Of course she wouldn't. She had already broken the rules by speaking to him once. Maybe that was why she stayed silent now. But Ethan knew one thing: she had saved him. And that meant she wasn't like the others. They reached a side chamber, and she pushed him inside before sealing the door behind them. The room was small, filled with control panels and a single monitor displaying security footage. Red warning lights flashed on the screen. More bodies. More auxiliary soldiers, dead. Something was very wrong. Ethan turned to her. Who's attacking? It's not my people, is it? She hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Rebels. Ethan frowned. Rebels? You mean Silari rebels? She nodded. That made no sense. The Auxiliary Imperium was strict, disciplined. He had never heard of internal conflicts within their ranks. If their own people were turning against them, then this war was more complicated than he thought. Ethan watched her closely. The way her fingers tightened around the hilt of her sword, the slight tension in her jaw. She was worried. And if a warrior like her was worried, things were bad. I need answers, he said. Why did you save me? She looked at him, golden eyes locked onto his. Silence stretched between them. For a moment, Ethan thought she wouldn't respond. Then softly, she said, You are different. Ethan blinked. Of all the answers he had expected, that wasn't one of them. Different? He echoed. How? She didn't answer, but something about the way she looked at him, studied him, made his chest tighten. Then, suddenly, her head snapped toward the door. A metallic sound echoed in the hallway. Footsteps, armored and heavy. More rebels. The warden's eyes darkened. We must go. Ethan clenched his fists. He had so many questions, but now wasn't the time. If she wanted to get him out, he wouldn't argue. She tapped a command into the control panel. A side hatch slid open, revealing a maintenance tunnel. Without hesitation, she stepped inside. Ethan smirked. You know, for someone forbidden to speak to prisoners, you sure talk a lot. She gave him a sharp look but didn't reply. Ethan chuckled and followed her into the tunnel. He didn't know where this was leading. But one thing was certain. This was no longer just about escape. Something deeper was happening. And the silent warden was at the center of it. The narrow maintenance tunnel was dark and cramped, the air thick with the scent of oil and metal. Ethan moved quickly, following the silent warden as she led the way through the maze of passages inside the prison ship. She was fast, her movements sharp and calculated, but Ethan could sense the tension in her shoulders. She was worried. For the first time since his capture, Ethan felt like something bigger was happening. He had expected to be tortured for information, maybe even executed. But instead, he was running through the ship alongside the very woman who was supposed to be his captor. And she had spoken to him, not just once, but multiple times. That had to mean something. Finally, they stopped. The warden placed her hand against a panel on the wall. It scanned her palm, and a small section of the floor slid open, revealing a hidden escape hatch. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You had an escape route this whole time. She glanced at him but said nothing. Ethan sighed. Right. Still not talking. She stepped aside, motioning for him to go first. Ethan hesitated. Where does it lead? Docking bay, she whispered. A ship. Ethan's pulse quickened. You're helping me escape. She didn't answer immediately. Her golden eyes searched his, as if she was trying to decide something. Then softly, she said, They ordered your execution. Ethan stiffened. So that was it. The Auxiliary Imperium had decided he wasn't worth keeping alive. Maybe they thought killing him would send a message to humanity. Maybe they simply saw him as useless. Either way, he was a dead man, unless he left this ship. He exhaled. And you don't agree with that? She looked away, her jaw tightening. That was all the answer he needed. Ethan stepped closer. Why are you doing this? You're risking everything for me. For the first time, the silent warden looked uncertain. She gripped the hilt of her sword tightly, as if grounding herself. I do not know. Ethan blinked. That was not what he expected. She turned her gaze back to him, frustration and conflict swirling in her golden eyes. You should be weak. You should be afraid. But you are not. Ethan gave a small smirk. Humans don't break easy. She inhaled deeply, as if she had already known that, but didn't want to believe it. A distant explosion rocked the ship. The rebels were still fighting. Time was running out. The warden's fingers twitched, and for a brief moment, she looked at him, not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as something else. Then, with a firm voice, she said, "Go." Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer before stepping toward the escape hatch. He didn't know why she was doing this, and maybe she didn't either. But one thing was clear. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. Ethan dropped down through the escape hatch, landing on a metal walkway below. The air smelled of fuel and burning circuits. The ship was shaking. Explosions from the rebel attack were getting stronger. The silent warden followed right behind him, her golden eyes scanning the area for threats. The docking bay was massive, filled with Silari warships and smaller transport vessels. Alarm sirens blared, and red warning lights flashed across the high metal walls. Smoke curled from damaged sections of the ship. Ethan turned to her. All right, you got me this far. Where's the ship? She pointed toward the far end of the docking bay. A sleek black Silari fighter sat ready, its cockpit open. It was smaller than he had hoped, but it would do. They moved quickly, keeping low behind crates and equipment. The sounds of distant gunfire echoed through the bay. Rebel forces were getting closer. Ethan glanced at the warden. You're coming with me, right? She hesitated. Then, slowly, she shook her head. Ethan frowned. You can't stay. They'll know you helped me. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. This is my home. He clenched his jaw. They ordered my execution. You saved me. You broke their rules. Do you really think they'll forgive that? Her eyes darkened, but she didn't answer. Ethan sighed. Look, I don't know why you did this. Maybe you see something in me. Maybe you don't. But if you stay, you die. Come with me. Before she could respond, a deep voice shouted from behind them. Halt! Ethan spun around. A squad of Silari soldiers stood at the entrance of the docking bay, weapons raised. Their armor gleamed under the flashing red lights. One of them stepped forward, his gaze cold and sharp. His armor had markings that showed his high rank. Commander Zevran, he said, addressing the silent warden. Step away from the human. Ethan felt the tension in the air. The warden's grip tightened on her sword. She didn't move. The officer's eyes narrowed. You betrayed the Imperium. Stand down now, and you may be given mercy. Ethan took a step back, preparing to make a run for the fighter. But before he could move, the warden spoke, her voice calm, but firm. No. The soldiers tensed. Ethan's heart pounded. The officer exhaled sharply, disappointment in his expression. Then you leave us no choice. He raised his hand. Fire. Everything happened at once. The warden lunged, her sword flashing, as she cut through the nearest soldier. Ethan sprinted toward the fighter, his mind racing. Plasma fire exploded around them. He reached the cockpit, jumping inside and activating the controls. The warden fought like a storm, her blade striking down enemies with deadly precision. But there were too many. Ethan gritted his teeth. He couldn't leave her. Not like this. With a deep breath, he made his decision. He was going back for her. Ethan's hands gripped the controls of the Silari fighter, his pulse racing. The engines roared to life, the ship's systems flashing green. He could escape. He could be free. But he couldn't leave her behind. His gaze snapped back to the docking bay. The silent warden, Commander Zevran, was surrounded. Plasma shots blazed through the air as she fought like a force of nature, her curved sword cutting through the soldiers with precise, deadly strikes. But even she couldn't fight forever. Ethan cursed under his breath. Damn it. Without another thought, he slammed the controls, powering down the thrusters. The ship wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. He jumped out of the cockpit and sprinted back into the chaos. The warden spun, dodging a plasma blast before slashing through another enemy. Her movements were fluid, perfect, until one of the soldiers fired from behind. "Look out!" Ethan shouted. She twisted at the last second, but the shot grazed her side. She staggered, her golden eyes flashing with pain. Ethan reached her just as another soldier charged. He grabbed a fallen enemy's weapon, raising it without hesitation. His human reflexes weren't as fast as auxiliaries, but he didn't need to be perfect, just quick enough. He fired. The plasma shot struck the attacker square in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. The warden looked at Ethan in shock. "You came back." He grinned. "Yeah, well, guess I'm an idiot." More soldiers stormed into the docking bay. They were running out of time. Ethan grabbed her wrist. "Come on. We need to go. Now." For a moment, she hesitated. Her golden eyes flickered with something deep, something unspoken. But then she nodded. Together, they ran. Plasma shots exploded around them as they sprinted toward the fighter. Ethan fired wildly over his shoulder, forcing the soldiers to take cover. The warden, despite her wound, moved like a shadow beside him. They'd reached the ship. Ethan jumped into the cockpit, powering up the engines as she climbed into the co-pilot's seat. The moment the hatch sealed, Ethan slammed the thrusters. The fighter roared forward, lifting off the docking bay floor. The enemy soldiers fired, but it was too late. The ship shot through the hangar doors, blasting into the void of space. Ethan exhaled sharply, his hands shaking on the controls. He glanced at the warden. She pressed a hand to her side where the plasma shot had grazed her, but she was still alert, watching him with unreadable eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she broke the silence. "You should have left me." Ethan smirked, shaking his head. "Not my style." She stared at him, something shifting in her gaze, something warmer. Then, quietly, she said, "I am glad you didn't." Ethan looked at her, and for the first time, he realized she wasn't just his captor anymore. She was something more. The stolen auxiliary fighter streaked through the vastness of space, its engines humming with power. The prison ship was now a distant speck, but Ethan knew they weren't safe yet. The auxiliary fleet would be hunting them soon. He kept his hand steady on the controls, his mind racing. Beside him, the silent warden, Commander Zevran, sat with a hand pressed to her wounded side. Despite the injury, her posture remained strong, her golden eyes fixed on the star-filled horizon. Ethan glanced at her. "You okay?" She hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "It is a minor wound." Ethan smirked. "Yeah, well, you lost a lot of blood for a minor wound." She didn't respond, but he noticed the way her fingers tightened against her side. She was tougher than most warriors he had seen, human or alien. Silence stretched between them for a few moments. Then Ethan spoke again. "So, what now?" Zevran turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable. "We must find a safe place. The Imperium will send hunters after us." Ethan sighed. "Great, so now we're both fugitives." A strange thought hit him. Just days ago, she had been his captor. Now she was his ally. Maybe even a friend. No, he wasn't sure about that yet, but she had risked everything to save him. That meant something. He leaned back in his seat, thinking. "There's an old human outpost not far from here. It's abandoned, but I can use it to send a message to my people." Zevran frowned slightly. "Your people will not trust me." Ethan shrugged. "Probably not. But they trust me. And if I tell them you saved my life, they might listen. She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then she gave a slow nod. Very well. Ethan set the coordinates, and the ship adjusted course. The hum of the engines filled the cockpit, but his mind was anything but calm. He glanced at her again. So tell me something. Why did you do it? She turned her gaze to him. Do what? Save me. Risk everything. Defy your own people. She was silent for a long time. Then, softly, she said, I do not know. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That's not an answer. She inhaled deeply. The Imperium teaches us that humans are weak, dishonorable. But you are not. You fight, even when you have no chance. You protect, even when it is not logical. That is unusual. Ethan smirked. Yeah, well, humans have a habit of surprising people. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes, a hint of admiration, maybe even respect. The ship soared through the void. Two fugitives from two warring species, bound by fate and choices neither of them fully understood. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. There was no turning back. The stolen auxiliary fighter drifted through the darkness of space, its engines humming softly. In the distance, a barren planet loomed, an old human outpost hidden beneath its rocky surface. Ethan checked the navigation screen. We're almost there. Zevran remained silent, her golden eyes watching the stars. Her wound had stopped bleeding, but she still looked tense. He could tell she was thinking, calculating, questioning. Ethan sighed. You're worried. She glanced at him. Your people will not welcome me. He leaned back in his seat, stretching his arms. Yeah, probably not. But they'll listen to me, and I'll make them understand. Zevran didn't look convinced. They will see me as the enemy. Ethan met her gaze. Are you? She hesitated. The answer wasn't as simple as it should have been. Before she could respond, the ship's sensors beeped. A warning flashed on the screen. Ethan frowned. That's not good. He tapped the controls, bringing up the radar. His stomach twisted. Auxiliary patrol ship. Zevran's expression darkened. They have found us. Ethan clenched his jaw. We can't outrun them in this ship. We need to land. He steered the fighter toward the planet, pushing the engines to their limit. The ship trembled as they entered the atmosphere, flames licking at the edges of the cockpit. The auxiliary patrol followed, firing plasma shots. One blast grazed their wing, sending sparks across the dashboard. Ethan gritted his teeth. Hold on. The ship dove toward the rocky terrain. The outpost was just ahead, a metal structure buried beneath the dust. Another blast rocked the fighter. Alarms blared. Zevran's fingers twitched toward her sword. We will not make it. Ethan smirked. Oh, we're making it. With a sharp turn, he forced the ship into a steep dive. The auxiliary patrol shot past them, unable to adjust in time. That gave them the opening they needed. Ethan pulled up at the last second, skimming the surface before slamming the landing gear down. The fighter slid across the dirt, metal screeching, before coming to a rough stop near the outpost entrance. Smoke filled the cockpit. Ethan coughed, shaking his head. See, told you we'd make it. Zevran exhaled slowly. You are reckless. He grinned. You're just figuring that out now. Before she could respond, another explosion shook the ground. The auxiliary patrol was landing nearby. They didn't have much time. Ethan unbuckled his harness. Come on. We need to get inside before they. A blast struck the ground beside them, sending dust into the air. The auxiliary soldiers were already here. Zevran drew her sword. Ethan grabbed a plasma rifle from the emergency supply rack. Their escape wasn't over yet. With a determined look, Ethan turned to Zevran. Ready? She gripped her blade. Always. Together, They ran into the fight. Ethan and Severin sprinted toward the entrance of the abandoned outpost as plasma fire rained down behind them. The auxiliary soldiers were fast, but Ethan had expected this. He wasn't going down without a fight. Severin moved like a shadow, her sword flashing in the dim light. She struck down one soldier with a swift, deadly motion, then turned to block another's attack. Ethan covered her, raising his plasma rifle and firing. A blue blast hit a auxiliary warrior in the chest, sending him sprawling. The outpost door was just ahead. Ethan slammed his hand against the control panel. "Come on, come on." The metal door groaned before sliding open. He grabbed Severin's wrist, pulling her inside just as another blast scorched the ground where they had stood. The door shut behind them with a loud clang. They were inside. For a moment, all they could hear was their heavy breathing. The sound of distant explosions outside slowly faded. Ethan leaned against the wall, exhaling. That was close. Severin glanced at him, her golden eyes sharp. "It is not over." She was right. The auxiliary soldiers wouldn't stop. But for now, they had a moment to think. Ethan turned toward the dark corridors of the outpost. Dust covered everything, and flickering emergency lights barely illuminated the space. It had been abandoned for years, but it still had one thing he needed: a communication system. He moved quickly, heading toward the control room. Severin followed, her hand still gripping her sword. She didn't trust this place, and Ethan didn't blame her. Inside the control room, Ethan powered up the old system. The screen flickered, and static filled the air. He adjusted the signal, searching for the right frequency. Finally, a voice crackled through. "Repeat. Identify yourself." Ethan's heart pounded. It was a human channel. He leaned forward. "This is Lieutenant Ethan Carter. I've escaped the auxiliary prison ship. I need immediate extraction. And," he glanced at Severin, "I'm not alone." There was silence. Then, a cautious voice replied, "Who is with you, Lieutenant?" Ethan hesitated, then spoke clearly. "Auxiliary warrior. She saved my life." The silence was longer this time. Finally, the voice responded, "Stand by." Ethan leaned back, sighing. "They're thinking about it." Severin watched him. "They do not trust me." "Can you blame them?" Ethan asked. "We've been at war for years." She didn't answer, but something in her gaze softened. Minutes passed. Then, finally, the radio crackled again. "Lieutenant Carter, we're sending a dropship to your location, but the auxiliary stays under guard." Ethan smirked. "Fair enough. We'll be ready." He turned to Severin. "Looks like we're getting out of here." She studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Ethan didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: this was only the beginning.